PMP exam micro bootcamp, dogged, rugged, and tough, part 2. Today we're going to have a quick recap on integration management, and then we're going to move on and cover 4 more knowledge areas really rapidly. So let's have a quick recap on integration management. Integration management consists of these 6 processes as you're studying for the PMP exam. You definitely have to be aware of the core inputs, the core tools and techniques, and the core output. So I've got a video on integration management that's out there. You'll see me on a whiteboard talking about this in detail. And if you wanted to study more on integration, I would recommend watching that video. I'll put a link below this one. But for now, if you're trying to get back on the wagon really quick, my recommendation is to ask yourself, what is this process all about? And how do I get my core outputs? So let's take a look at that. In Develop Project Charter, the major output you get is the project charter itself. What is the project charter? It's a document that authorizes the project. Okay? What do you have as inputs? How do you get the charter? Well, the charter contains a lot of high-level information, high-level schedule, high-level milestones, high-level deliverable description, high-level scope, high-level risk, so on and so forth. So some of the information in the charter comes out of existing agreements, like your contract, your memorandum of understanding, your LOI, stuff like that. You also get some of the high-level scope from your project statement of work. And your project statement of work is a high-level narrative of what the project is meant to do that comes from the customer. Okay, so some of that stuff makes its way into the charter. How does it do it? Well, the project manager and the sponsor work together, sometimes with other people, hence facilitation techniques, and they work with other people to come out with the project charter. So on some projects, it may just be the project manager working under the direction of the sponsor. Other times, it might be the sponsor and the PM working closely together. And sometimes it might be a wider body of people, depending on the project. Okay? So that's the Develop Project Charter process. Develop Project Management Plan, this one, the main goal is to come up with the project management plan. Again, facilitation techniques is used. The meeting of the minds, different people participate in this because this contains outputs from other processes. You see, these outputs from other processes are going to be collated into that project management plan. The project management plan is a collection of several subsidiary plans, and as you move along the project, several project management plan updates, which are encapsulated in this outputs from other processes. Okay? The next process, direct and manage project work, is instrumental in coming out with your major deliverable. So when you see deliverables here, if I can get the slide up, here, when you see deliverables, it really means that you are done creating a discrete item that has been described in the project management plan. In other words, your project management plan has now become an input. You have executed upon the plan. If there are any change requests, you have also executed upon those change requests, and you've come out with your final product, service, or result, known as a deliverable. Okay? In this process, you could also come out with observations on the project, raw observations, which we call work performance data. Do you remember that from your studying? WPD comes out of here. This is the only place that you get WPD. Okay. Moving on to the next process, monitor and control project work. Monitor and control project work is all about the integrative monitoring and controlling of the work being done on the project. Okay. We have a few unique ones here: schedule forecasts and cost forecasts. Okay. We also have work performance information. That stuff, through expert judgment and analytical techniques, is going to end up being compiled into a work performance report. That is a major output of this process, WPR. Okay. Next process, perform integrated change control. This is where change requests are reviewed. Change requests, they are going to be reviewed through meetings, and these meetings are going to be held by the change control board, and ultimately they're going to approve or reject a change request. All that information about the approvals or the rejections is going to be put into a change log. And if we get approved change requests, well, that's there. Approved change requests. We can see these approved change requests are the same ones being put back into direct and managed project work. Last but not least, close project or phase. In close project or phase, we're closing out either a phase in the project or the entire project. So we've got accepted deliverables, which are deliverables that have been accepted by the customer. These need to be transitioned over to the client or the end user. So we've got an output called final product, service, or result transition linked to that accepted deliverable. We also use analytical techniques. In some instances, we may need to assess why the project was shut down and where the work exactly stopped as the project was put on hold or shut down. We also need expert judgment. We also, of course, carry out a lessons learned, and that is encapsulated in organizational process assets updates. Okay? So that's pretty much integration. Very rapidly, let's go into scope management. Scope management is all about scoping out the project to truly understand all the work that needs to be done to achieve the end result that we desire, that we have put into our plans and our scope baseline. Okay, so let's take a close look. So taking a close look at scope management, we can see we've got plan scope management, collect requirements, define scope, create WBS, validate scope, and control scope. So let's talk about this knowledge area in some more detail. Scope management is all about, again, planning how to carry out scope activities on the project. And to do that, you first of all want to have a plan for how you're going to do it, and that's called plan scope management. Two plans come out of here: the scope management plan, which guides you on how to carry out scope activities and mentions the scope activities and the intensity and depth of these activities. And then we also have the requirements management plan, which guides us on how to collect requirements and how to manage the requirements. The next process is collect requirements, the actual collection of the requirements. The next one is define scope. This is where we define all the work that has to be done to achieve these requirements that we've observed in collect requirements. So collect requirements has to come before define scope. A lot of times people say, why do I define scope? It's really collecting requirements. No, it's not. No, it's not. Collect requirements is about identifying the features and the functions of the product, service, or result. Define scope is about identifying all the work that must be done to deliver those requirements. See, create WBS. This is where we create a breakdown of all the work to be done to deliver the identified requirements. Your WBS could be broken down into phases. It could be broken down into deliverables, preferably deliverable oriented. And remember the features of the WBS. That's important for your exam. Validate scope. This is where the customer reviews the final deliverable. And control scope. This is where the project manager ensures that only the work required is being done to prevent scope creep. We're trying to prevent gold plating. We're trying to prevent scope creep. Gold plating, people add in extras that were not asked for, thinking they're doing the customer a favor, and scope creep, the general term that refers to the increment of scope in an uncontrolled fashion. So a key thing here is the creation of the WBS. The Department of Energy has some great tutorials out there. And this is actually from one of their tutorials. They have a WBS for building a house, as you can see, level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. They've chosen to put the housing corporation at level 1, but you could also bypass that and go straight to the house building project at level 1, and you can see how it's broken down. Don't forget, the numbering scheme is called the Code of Accounts. Don't forget the particular features in the WBS. Also, the OBS is often discussed alongside the WBS because when you juxtapose them and put the OBS on its side, you get a RAM, a responsibility assignment matrix. Now, don't forget, your responsibility assignment matrix could be converted into a RACI chart. And the RAM could be a very useful tool in human resource management. Let's zero in on these ITTOs. Plan, scope management. Again, you get these two, your two plans that govern how you're going to do everything else. These plans govern all of these because we see the scope management plan and requirements management plan as an input. Scope management plan and input. Scope management plan and input. We've got the project management plan, which is an input, but these are implicitly in here, okay? So when you take a look at these two, validate scope and control scope, don't lose sight of the fact that you still have your scope management plan implicitly in here, all right? So collect requirements, our next process. We can see that we've got those two plans that are guiding us on how to carry out collecting requirements. Now we've got two outputs, the requirements documentation and the requirements traceability matrix. How do we get from here to here? Well, we use all of these great tools and techniques, interviews, focus groups, facilitated workshops, group creativity techniques, coming up with creative ways for identifying the scope that needs to be done, group decision-making techniques, plurality, unanimity, dictatorship, and so on. Questionnaires and surveys need no introduction, observations, observing people to see how they are carrying out their work duties, prototypes to get early feedback, benchmarking using a standard of a previous project or using features in a previous product to determine your requirements, context diagrams, which shows how data goes into a business system and the flow of data in, data out flows, and document analysis, because we could have business documents, maybe business operating processes and procedures that will help us to glean our requirements. That's the main thing. So we carry out this document analysis to glean requirements that make their way into these requirements documentation or requirements traceability matrix. Now, the requirements traceability matrix, if you haven't taken a look in your PMBOK guide to really see the RTM, there's an example there. I would advise you take a look at that. Requirements documentation is quite specific to showing how those requirements will meet the business need, okay? Going over to the next process, define scope. The major thing you get out is your project scope statement. Your project scope statement contains inclusions, exclusions, constraints, assumptions, deliverable description, acceptance criteria. That stuff is very important. So as you take a look at your project scope statement, know what is in it, okay? How do we get there? Well, we have our plan, we have our charter, we're going to do product analysis, which is very important. Product analysis is going to help us glean what exactly needs to be done to deliver those features and functions. A product analysis will zero in on the features and functions and tie them to actions that need to be done to deliver them. Hence, project scope statement. Your project scope statement contains a lot of that, alternatives generation, generating alternatives for meeting those features that you've identified. See, we also have requirements documentation because that tells us how those requirements meet the business need. Okay, or satisfy the business need. So, alternatives generation, requirements documentation, all this stuff works hand in hand. And of course, you've got facilitated workshops that bring it all together, and you get your project scope statement. Inclusions, exclusions, constraints, assumptions, very important. Create WBS is our next process here in scope, and this is putting together that WBS I showed you. Major tool and technique is decomposition, and of course you need expertise, expert judgment to put one of those together. There are many different ways to skin a cat. Many people say, oh, I want to build my WBS by phase. Some people say, no, I'm building it by deliverable. There's no right or wrong way. Before you exam, you do want to observe that the scope baseline is the output, because your scope baseline contains your WBS dictionary, and your project scope statement. Okay, it contains those three things. As a result, we don't have the WBS explicitly mentioned. We have scope baseline. Okay. All right, let's erase some of this and move on to our next process, validate scope. Validate scope, this is where your customer, through inspection, is going to accept, hopefully, the deliverable. What are they inspecting? They're inspecting something called verified deliverables. And that comes from quality control, from the control quality process. So if you've got a verified deliverable, it gets inspected, you get accepted deliverables. What are they inspecting it against? Well, they're inspecting it against this thing here. Requirements traceability matrix and requirements documentation. Okay? Don't forget that work performance data makes its appearance here and here as well. And anytime you see work performance data in the PMBOK guide, you know you're going to see work performance information coming out. Okay? You can also see it here, work performance information coming out. WPD going in, WPI coming out. Okay? Validate scope, of course, uses inspection, like I said, to come out with that. And control scope uses variance analysis to analyze how far away are we from the mark. Are we really doing what we said we would? Are we really carrying out the scope that we need to, or are we doing stuff that we shouldn't be doing? Okay, so all that is helpful in determining how far along we are. WPI. Okay, and that is pretty much it for scope management. Know your processes, know your inputs, know how they're linked to outputs. And when you come across those questions, they won't be able to bamboozle you. Okay? Let's move on to time management.